I'm very, very happy that my friend Jovanavic agreed to participate in this because he really has been an incredible leader for the pro-democracy movement since the early 1980s when he fought against the autocratic regime of Slobodan Milosevic. And he's been working for a long time in defending and promoting the transformation of democracy in Serbia, and in fact, even in wider area of Europe. And after he served as ambassador to Indonesia and several Southeast Asian countries, he came back to Serbia and he ran for a parliamentary seat in 2016, and he became, in 2017, he became president of the Civic Platform. So anyway, Jovan, thank you very much. I know that it's evening in your time. It's probably past or just before dinner time, but thank you very much for taking out your evening to address the Colorado Foothills World Affairs Council.
Thank you. Good evening from Belgrade, Serbia. It's a great pleasure to be this evening with you. And thank you, Stan, for this opportunity, and thank you to the Council. And thank you for this really nice introductory remarks. So you put a heavy burden on my shoulders, and your reason this is high expectations. Well, I'll try to respond to that and to meet your expectations. I think it's a really great timing for such an event, having in mind that the new U.S. administration just took over last week, less than a week ago. And so in different parts of the world, there is an expectation and I would say hope that the new US administration will re-energize democratic momentum and motivate, support, and protect democratic forces around the globe. And in that sense, in that regard, I agree with Larry Diamond, who is one of the leading world scholars on democracy, and whom I really have a pleasure and honor to know for the last 15 years, since I was the first generation of the Stanford's Center on Democracy Development and Rule of Law program back in 2005, and I had the pleasure to listen for 3 weeks to his lectures, and also Michael Max-Paul's lectures, who is currently director of the Freeman Spalding Institute for International Affairs at Stanford University, of course, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, and also advisor to President Obama on Russia. So I agree with Larry on his assessment that the defense and spread of democratic ideals relies on U.S. global leadership, and that U.S. should reclaim its traditional place as the cornerstone of democracy. And if the U.S. fails to do so, authoritarian regimes would continue to spread and further open up the space primarily for Russia and China, as some label them authoritarian juggernauts, and their followers and admirers around the world, to turn this 21st century into the dark ages of illiberal authoritarianism. So when I already mentioned Larry Diamond, I would like to use, and I hope that we can use soon, rephrase the title of the last book, which was The Ill Winds, Saving Democracy from Russian Age, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency, into the changing winds and saving democracy from Russian spoiling, still Chinese rising ambition, and the European inwardness. It's very important, this European inwardness by American democratic engagement. This European inwardness and just looking after their own problems is very important for people from Eastern Europe, especially Southeastern Europe, which are still aspiring to join the European Union. However, we experience today different international context, international environment than 30 or 20 even years ago, when in the 90s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we experienced for some time, I would say, unipolar world, in which this triumph of democracy and the end of history was, they were proclaimed, and the liberal democracy was the only legitimate game in town, the only legitimate political concept and idea. And only some maybe 15 years ago, we experienced this peak of the third wave of democratization, using Samuel Huntington's terminology, when at one moment we had over half of the world's population and more than half of the countries having some kind of democratic system. But for the last 15 years, we have experienced the constant democratic backsliding, democratic recession, and the growing momentum for liberal populism. And this is time and again confirmed in different reports of prominent international organizations dealing with such issues, such as the Freedom House annual reports. Year after year, we have this democratic backsliding and more increasing number of countries going towards authoritarian regimes. And there are many reasons for that. One of the reasons were the US led interventions, first in Iraq and then afterwards in Libya, where many people around the world identify democracy promotion with these military interventions and occupation of the countries, which negatively affected image and soft power of the United States. Then we had also global economic and financial crisis in 2007 and 8, which originated in the United States. Then various negative consequences of globalization, which are concentration of wealth, widening gaps between urban and rural areas, then those who are better educated and less educated, increased migration, shrinking of the middle class, especially the higher middle class, which either backslided towards the middle class or many of them just left the country if they had their countries if they had opportunity. This is what is happening also in Serbia, where more than 50,000 people each year leaves the country, which is for a country of 7 million, less than 7 million, huge number, and mostly these are physicians or engineers, etc. So we experience a huge brain drain. Then also, I think what is very important is that in the previous 4 years, we had some kind of deterioration of democracy in the US, and this Trump's transactional foreign policy with little care for democratic values and human rights. And of course, which probably culminated during this protest on January the 6th and further negatively affected the US image in the world. And last but not least, not only in these 4 years, but a long time before, we have a resurgence and insurgence of global autocratic powers such as Russia and China, which started using these weaknesses of the global liberal system and their major players and protagonists to increase their own influence. At the same time, leaders in many countries realize that they can tighten their grip on power if they replicate models of other autocrats. In Eastern Europe, primarily those models set by Putin or Erdogan in Turkey, and along with trying to exert maximum benefit from playing against each other major geopolitical actors. And they are this so-called the autocrats playbook contains different steps, instruments, and some are applied simultaneously. But in the case of Serbia, what was really important, first step at the time, the leader of the winning party and current president Vučić, he became, after the elections in 2012, first deputy prime minister, but he was the most powerful person also at the time in the country. And what he became immediately coordinator of all intelligence agencies and also Minister of Defense. So one of the first steps from this autocrat's playbook is to take control of these services and the army. And also it's to, then they try to demonize critical press, to take control, extinguish this media pluralism and take control of many media and buy media. So their allies or cronies or inner circle, they start buying media. In Serbia, we had 2-3 years ago the case that publicly owned company, Telecom, they bought a second largest cable network provider for an inflated amount of money. And then that provider bought 2 remaining private TV stations that had a national coverage. So besides that, these autocrats, including in Serbia, they go after political opposition, they demonize the opposition, they call them traitors, enemies, etc. Of course, they go after also judiciary, after independent judiciary, and after bureaucracy. So they are filling in not only just the highest position from members of the ruling party, they're filling not only the highest, but they're going deep down to the very bottom. And now we have approximately 700,000 people working in the public sector, which is like 10% of the whole population. And we are facing very ridiculous situation that the salaries in public sectors are higher than in private sector, maybe around 20%. So there is no motivation practically for people to work in private sector if they would earn less and work more. And also a curiosity is that currently the ruling party in Serbia has more members than the largest German parties, for example, even though Serbia is 12 times smaller. So people join the ruling party to get a job. So this is simply put. So speaking about, going back about increasing Russian and Chinese presence around the world, including in Europe, especially in the neighboring countries of the EU. EU adopted this, I would say, geopolitical approach. Also, we could call it stabilitocracy approach. And in that way, pushed back and marginalized democratic values that are the cornerstone of this very European integration from the very beginnings in the 1950s. And even the commission that was formed in November, created in November 2019, after elections in 2019 in the European Union, labeled itself as a geopolitical commission. And such an approach was confirmed by Mr. Varhelyi, his Commission Neighborhood and Enlargement Commissioner. He is, by the way, Hungarian. He is very close ally of Prime Minister Orban. During the AFET, this is the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Commission meeting in January, and I had the pleasure to attend. And also after that, at the conference, I participated in the European Parliament alongside with 2 European commissioners. So he confirmed that approach, this geopolitical approach. I had an opportunity also to talk to him in between the sessions, since fortunately his chief of staff is my colleague from Harvard. And so we had this long conversation, and I came to the conclusion that there is not much hope for the support for democratic forces in Serbia, and that this geopolitical approach is just dominant. And at this conference, I presented also a reverse report on the EU and the Western Balkans. It was a liberal perspective on the accession process. It was created by several political parties and organizations from the region, liberal parties. And we had some recommendations to the European Union how to change their approach, how to improve their approach, to make it, to provide more clarity, support, and realistic perspectives for the aspiring members. As well, and this is what was my stance, is that the EU should implement some kind of very strict measures of measuring progress wherever it's possible, and to do naming and blame, to name and blame those officials and institutions responsible for shortcomings and delays, etc., in that process. Because of this already mentioned geopolitical approach, democratic forces in the region, but particularly in Serbia, because in the meantime some changes happen in some countries, in Montenegro, in Northern Macedonia, etc. These democratic forces feel abandoned, marginalized, even betrayed. So European Commission uses their annual progress reports to assess the situation in the candidate countries, but and especially in the last 2 years, it uses some kind of critical language, but it's very technocratic, very encoded, and even people who are dealing with European integration issues, they frequently do not read carefully these reports. And also these reports tend to portray situation in countries in a brighter light by using this diplomatic language. And this is what regimes in these countries use to just present themselves in better light that there are some successes in this European integration process. But speaking of Serbia, there is no progress, because in the last year, no chapter was open. Out of 35, Serbia opened by now, I think, 18 or 19 chapters. So, but last year, no chapter was open in the negotiation process. So, what I also advocated for is that EU should find another format to make their criticism clear and understandable, because what matters most are the images that are sent to the public when European officials, and not only European, but mostly EU officials, high officials, meet with high officials from the region, especially with the Serbian president. And they see images of very cordial relations, and they repeat, the officials, that they repeat that these countries are on good path. And I would say the most blatant example was in April 2018, when the president of the European Council, which I would say is the most important body within the European Union, comprised of the heads of states and governments of the all EU countries, plus the president of the European Commission. So Donald Tusk, who was at the time president of the European Council, former Polish prime minister, he visited Serbia, and then he had this, what I call it, George W.-like moment when he met, you remember, of course, when he met Putin, and when he said that he saw Putin's soul through his eyes. So I really need to quote this sentence. It was just as a good illustration of how EU leaders behave, or their attitude towards some autocrats. So I quote Donald Tusk. He said, in politics, he was talking to President Vučić, Serbian President Vučić. In politics, you are as creative as Nikola Tesla was in science, as effective as Novak Djokovic has been in tennis, and whenever you want to, as charming as your kolo dance, the traditional Serbian dance. So this is just an example of crossing this, I would say, lines, or acceptable lines in communication between the high officials. And so this is one of the major reasons why EU faces decreasing credibility among the citizens, especially those who are pro-European and pro-Western. And the other reason is also that it's related to the rule of law and upholding democratic standards. Since across its neighborhood and in the Western Balkans, the European Union promotes improving and functioning and independence of the judiciary in reducing corruption. But it is much harder now to convince these aspiring countries to follow these recommendations and instructions when you have two countries within the EU who have clearly autocratic regimes, like in Poland and Hungary, which are doing the same thing. So that's the problem. So I will now just talk briefly about these two countries, because this is also a topic about the Eastern Europe. And so we can see that this worrisome trend of the increasing number and solidification of autocratic regime and this competitive autocracies has also affected the EU. But fortunately, due to EU membership, although this EU mechanism have a limited reach, this instrument prevented some of the worst consequences of the government autocratic policies, particularly due to the fact that still an overwhelming majority of the populations and citizens, both of Hungary and Poland, they support EU membership. They are clearly and strongly pro-European. So since it is expected that all around the world the Biden's administration would weaken authoritarian populist governments, it is also expected to happen in these two countries. And if I'm not wrong, during the election campaign, Biden put together Poland and Hungary with Belarus and mentioned them as an example of rising totalitarian regimes in the world. So it seems that after 4 years of hiding behind Donald Trump, these two regimes were hiding behind, and they had support from Donald Trump. They now suddenly found themselves exposed. So there is no surprise that Biden's victory was met with some kind of lukewarm congratulations from the leaders of these countries, and with some kind of even fear and disgust. And similarly happened in Serbia when President Vučić said that before he didn't get along well with Biden, that he congratulated him, and that's it, more or less. That was Serbian president's statement. Speaking of Hungary, Orban, Hungarian Prime Minister, batted on Trump's victory, especially since during the Obama's administration, there was a high criticism of the behavior of his government. He came to power in 2010. So he also tried to juggle these several geopolitical balls, and particularly maintaining close relations with Russia and China. But he somehow got away in his regime from some more serious consequences within the European Union, because his party just enjoyed some kind of protection from the largest group within the European Parliament, the European People's Parties, and especially from some allies from Germany, especially Christian Social Union from Bavaria. And but it seems that Poland finds itself in more difficult situation now, the Polish regime, and they have more reasons to worry about this change in Washington, since when this ruling Law and Order party came to power in 2015, first they chose as the main partner within the EU, they chose UK. But then after the Brexit, they put almost all their bets on Trump. So now they are in a bit isolated, and it was the departure from the two main principles of Poland's post-communist foreign policy strategy. One is to avoid dependence on any country, and the other one is to avoid isolation at any cost. So this case of Poland was proof for Trump that foreign policy could be transactional because the Polish government signed several armed contracts with the US in exchange for some symbolic gestures by Trump, for example, during the presidential election campaign. President Duda was hosted by President Trump in the White House. And these excellent relations with Trump were supposed to enable Poland to dismiss the European Union criticism about violating the rule of law in their country, especially coming from this criticism was coming especially from their Western neighbor from Germany. In 2000, because of these problems with the two countries, with Hungary and Poland, with these autocratic policies and tendencies there, the European Council and the European Parliament agreed last year that they would to make some changes in decisions regarding EU funding and to introduce the qualified majority vote, but due to the crisis at the end of the last year, when it was during the process of adopting new EU budget, they postponed this introduction of this new mechanisms. And now I'm coming to more strictly to the Western Balkans and Serbia. And as I already said before, this rising authoritarianism in the Western Balkans is characterized by similar mechanisms like in the other parts of the world, which include the state capture, social polarization, media control, the creation of constant crisis, and the use of these external powers to balance outside influences. So, especially due to this aspiration, the European aspiration, these formal democratic institutions still coexist with the authoritarian tendencies, and they result in this so-called competitive authoritarian regimes. So these formal democratic institutions are widely accepted as the main means of gaining and fulfilling political will in such regimes, but political actors, at the same time, political actors and leaders often break these rules. So it's really difficult to maintain even the minimum of democratic standards due to that. So we saw that the media are there really heavily controlled, and I already mentioned some examples in Serbia. Or for example, I will just mention another example. One of the most popular private TV station in Serbia during the presidential campaign aired President Vučić's campaign and materials about his campaign 267 times more than all other presidential candidates together. So I think it's a really good illustration of what's going on in media sphere in Serbia. So I would also like to mention that this Western Balkan area already has this well-known role of a proxy stage for geostrategic confrontation. And we have, for the last few years, re-emergent interest of the United States in the region. In the beginning, it was mainly focused on the telecommunications and intending to prevent China's companies for supplying equipment for the 5G networks across the region. But in the meantime, over time, this Washington's involvement's grown, especially at the end of the last year, and grown up into some kind of comprehensive strategy of political pressure and economic incentives to regain this regional initiative from Beijing. And I think that a blueprint was established to the Washington Agreement, which was signed in September last year on economic normalization between Kosovo and Serbia, which offered intensified bilateral economic relations and investment finance in return for support on political issues. So there are some other examples in the region. For example, Albania joined recently the Clean Network initiative, and immediately the bilateral economic agreement, upgraded bilateral economic agreement with the US was signed. There is also some kind of pressure from the US on some countries to leave Chinese-led 17 plus China and 17 Central and Eastern European countries. The initiative started in 2012, and between 2013 and 19, every year a summit was held in different countries in the regions. And from this 17+1 initiative to the 3Cs initiative. So, of course, China also has some strong cards up its sleeve. These are particular financing infrastructural projects around the region. You have the high-speed railway, one of the projects between Budapest and Belgrade, and highways, etc., etc. And what we can see that there is an increasing correlation between political proximity to Beijing and the level of bilateral economic cooperation. And the best example is Serbia, which is the most prominent partner of China in the region, where several projects have been announced just over the last few months. Of course, the EU plays also a very dynamic role with the large investments funds for the region, and also trying to pull candidate countries away from China's influence. But there are also some political initiatives, but what is really important is that Serbia didn't support some of the EU initiatives, and that there is a declining alignment of the Serbian foreign policy with the European. Just in 2012, just before the new regime came to power, Serbian foreign policy was 99% aligned with the EU. At last year, only 57. So Serbia didn't support joint statement on human rights situation in Xinjiang, and also didn't support policy towards the Hong Kong, and etc. But instead it supported Chinese stand and align even within the UN with the countries like North Korea, etc. So there is also, now we come also this new context with the COVID-19 pandemic, and with this economic crisis we all experience. So, and this hunt or scramble for large supplies of vaccines. So now countries of the region, they are pushed even more rigorously to choose sides. And during this pandemic, it was really because in the last few years, Serbia had closer relations with Russia than with China. But beginning with the pandemic, the roles just switched, and Serbia replaced Russia with China as preferred, as an Eastern partner. And I think that the regime in Serbia, particularly President Vučić, he understood that the West takes China much more seriously than Russia. So by getting closer to China, his intention is to raise his price at the international level. On the other hand, China's interest is to improve its image in the world, in the middle of Europe, by presenting itself as a humanitarian force instead of the country from which the virus originated. So the way the Serbian tabloids and state officials once treated Russia, praising it to heavens, is the same way they now treat China. And at the same time, China is interested in having its foothold in Europe, in an EU candidate country, but without regulatory burden that comes from the formal membership in the EU. And Belgrade was Serbia was one of the first countries in Europe to receive Chinese aid and expertise over the pandemic. And this cooperation has continued to deepen. And President Vučić, Serbian president, welcomed the Chinese aid at the airport. He even kissed Chinese flag at the airport. He called Chinese President Xi brother. He announced 100 years of centennial of friendship of steel between Serbia and China. And he was talking at the time about the lack of European solidarity regarding a pandemic, and that the only help could come from China. So it was really, since the regime controls majority of TV stations and national frequency and practically all daily newspapers, it was easy for them to create this new narrative. And so the European Union has been marginalized, even though the EU sent probably more help than China, because it's really untransparent. We don't know how much of help Serbia just received as a donation and how much of that bought from China. So over the last few months, or more than half a year, China is the most visible country in Serbia and Serbian foreign policy. Also, Serbia, as I mentioned, supports Chinese One China policy in relation to Taiwan. So, what is also important, just to mention, to say a few words about relations between Belgrade and Moscow, because it's usually perceived as a traditional alliance between two Slavic and Orthodox nations, but the picture is more complicated and has always depended on constellation of strategic interest. And I think that government in Belgrade, they become, this new partnership began only in 2008, after the recognition, after the Kosovo's unilateral declaration of independence. And then Serbia moved closer to Russia in order to secure UN Security Council veto to block this international recognition of Kosovo. And of course, Russian President Putin is very popular in Serbia, but on the other hand, it was also, this popularity was generated by the media which are close to the government. And if you see the analysis, I remember, for example, in 2016, over the course of only 4 months, President Putin appeared 71 times on cover pages of different dailies and magazines in Serbia. So, and it's always portrayed positively and as a defender of Serbia and Serbian people, etc., etc. So when you do the media analysis, there is practically no negative articles on Russia, and these articles are always very emotionally charged and very positive towards Russia. It used to be, at least in the last few years. So with this background of NATO intervention back in 1999 and tensions with other ethnic groups and the rejection of the independence of Kosovo by many Serbs, along with the regime failure to improve quality of life, the existence of weak institutions and the lack of perspective, create an environment, Kremlin-friendly environment for their narratives, and which are easily exploited by Russian media who are present here, like Sputnik or RT. Also, Russian businesses present here, and they are owners of the Gazprom is owner of the biggest energy company in Serbia. It's the biggest taxpayer, and for Serbia is the problem, this energy dependency on Russia. But however, despite this, I would say some 10 or so years of really close relations between Russia and Serbia, for the past maybe 2 years or 3, this partnership has been gradually declining. Beyond the fact that in both economic and military terms, Serbian cooperation was more significant with the West than with Russia. Russian influence in the Balkans also experienced several blows, especially when Montenegro joined NATO in 2017 and North Macedonia followed this suit last year. Also, on the Kosovo issue, the relations are becoming very complicated for the two countries because there are these ongoing negotiations about resolving this issue, and it's a very slippery ground for the Serbian regime if they agree on recognizing Kosovo, but at the same time Russia doesn't. So it would be really a hard blow to this regime, and Russia would present itself as a defender of Serbian people in a sense, and not the current regime. Well, I would just conclude with this assessment of the situation in Serbia, that Serbia's, I already mentioned there is Serbia's significant downslide in terms of media freedoms, freedom of expression, the rule of law, and corruption, and it found reflection in the periodic reports of the most prominent international organization dealing with these issues. So hence, according to Reporters Without Borders, the International Research and Exchange Board, since 2012, both Serbia press freedom rankings decreased sharply and media sustainability index dropped because of the rising media polarization, an increase in fake news and editorial pressure from media. Furthermore, Freedom House reports about the continuous deterioration in the conduct of election, the government's attempts to undermine independent media through legal harassment and smear campaigns, and unconstitutional accumulation of executive powers by President Vučić, due to which Serbia's status finally descended from free to partly free in 2019 and becoming a hybrid regime. And speaking of corruption, in 2018, Serbia was blacklisted by the Financial Action Task Force, and this is a status dedicated to countries that fail to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. In addition, Transparency International findings portray a significant increase in perceived corruption beginning in 2012, precisely where President Vučić, Serbian Progressive Party, came to power. And by way of concluding, so the widespread impression is that the US and the EU tolerate undemocratic behavior in many countries, including Serbia, for the sake of stability, and it should be changed. And the Western powers to autocratic governments, including in Serbia, should be changed into support of citizens and pro-democratic forces, because if they continue to portray an embellished picture of the situation in these countries and use vague language, it can only contribute to further decline of pro-Western and pro-EU sentiments and further discourage genuinely pro-democratic and reformist forces. And it seems that we are entering the period in which it will be decided for many years ahead where we will be living, whether we will be living in a new era of authoritarianism or a new age of democratic renewal. And so this new US administration brings hope that the negative long-lasting trend of democratic backsliding could be reversed and that the global democratic renaissance could occur. So I think that I already talked long enough, and I'm open to your questions. We're happy to open.
I have a question, if it's okay to ask. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It was excellent. I wanted to ask you regarding Russia, do you think the efforts through Navalny will result in Putin eventually not getting reelected, or is his autocracy just so strong it'll just wipe out Navalny's effort?
Well, I'm not specialist in Russia, and as we talked just before we started this lecture, I didn't have a chance to talk to my human rights activists and friends, pro-democracy friends in Moscow who participated in these protests. But what it looked to me is that Putin's regime is definitely it's weakening, you know, and but I think that it's still strong enough to survive. For how long, I really don't know. I'm not specialist in Russia, so but we all hope for some positive changes in Russia.
Jovan, I'd like to ask you to delve in more in terms of the U.S. role in promoting democracy. Since Joe Biden has already made it very clear that promoting democracy will be one of his key points in his foreign policy, and he's put people in place that also are very pro-democracy. Tony Blinken at State Department, which can do a great deal in terms of diplomacy, also for educational and other exchanges. Then Samantha Powers at USAID in terms of investing in civic society and pro-democracy organizations, and then Linda Greenfield Thomas at the UN, which I think could play a role in terms of coalitions for pro-democracy coalitions. So those are just some examples. I'm just wondering if you could comment on how much space is there actually for your movement, and how could the United States be most effective in supporting democracy in Serbia?
Well, yeah, as I already mentioned, that there are hopes that the U.S. policy would change towards Serbia as well. And unfortunately, what we experienced in the last few years is that both the U.S. ambassadors, especially the current one, and the EU ambassador, they acted more like spokespersons of the government than really doing their job, which they were supposed to do. So hopefully it would change. And what is very important, I mentioned on purpose, also European Union, it's that coordinated approach of the EU and the US in this part of the world, including Serbia. So trying to make some kind of synergy of their activities. There is a lot of room, especially I would say it would be helpful to try to diversify and the media scene in Serbia, and to support independent media, which are really of just a few, because there is a lot of pressure from the regime, especially they exert this pressure through advertising or choosing to whom to, where to advertise. So they are constantly avoiding this a few remaining independent media. So I think that would be very important, and also to try to change a bit approach and to support more like in some new grassroots organization, something what is already to some extent done by the European Endowment for Democracy, and not to just to recycle this I would say this representative of the civil sector, which are not that much civil sector anymore after 30 years. They've been present there for so many years, and we see the results of their activities as well, but they are still powerful. They have these connections with in the power centers, etc., centers of power. So just also to try to diversify also this civil sector scene in these countries. So I know you already mentioned Blinken and some others who are familiar with the region, and they're sensitive to the problems here. So hopefully much more attention would be put into this region and support also these pro-democratic forces. What we experience also myself and my organization, and it's also this media marginalization, not only by the regime media, this is expected, but also by so-called independent media. And for example, during the previous legislature, I was president of one of the parliamentary groups for a year and a half, and I was very active in the parliament, but somehow I was never invited by any of these media outlets for giving any interview, etc. And you have this stabilization of media, which is not only Serbia, of course, but it's in Serbia. It's I would say it's just lifted to some higher degree. And you need mostly, if you have no influence from before in media, then it's very hard to get through. Only if you do some scandals and provocation, if you sing in the parliament, or you bring some stones or whatever, or your course or whatever, then but this is not the way especially myself and people around me would like to conduct politics. So if you are trying to talk really on issues in a very grounded way, then almost nobody pays attention to you. So you need to provoke all the time, etc., in order to be in media. So my answer is just to come to the beginning. This coordinated efforts by and policies by EU and US new administration, I think that would be crucial for this region.
Okay, thank you.
Because in the past,
yeah. So it sounds like maybe like the organizations like the Soros Society or other organizations that invest in free media could be useful.
Well, if I may just relate to that, Soros Foundation, whatever, Foundation for Open Society Foundation, was involved in the last year in a dialogue. So they tried to be a mediator. Their director here tried to be a mediator between the opposition and the government on the election conditions, but their efforts really failed, miserably failed, because the majority opposition didn't run in the last year elections due to unfair and unfree conditions. So I think that the reputation of the Soros Foundation in Serbia was tarnished by this role, which was perceived as trying to help the government to bring the opposition to run into election, even though the conditions were not fair.
Yeah. I have a question from Joe Shaw, and just for the whole audience. So I actually, for the purpose of recording, I could only see the speaker, and for some reason I can also see Joe. So, okay. So I'm going to call on Joe now, but anybody else who wants to ask a question, either put it in the chat room or raise your hand. There's a function to raise your hand, and then I'll be able to see that. Thank you. Joe.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jovanovic. It was interesting that you started your presentation with Larry Diamond. He was the last flesh and blood speaker we had before our organization, before the COVID pandemic. But my question deals with democracy. The United States in the last several months has not been exactly the glowing example of a successful democracy. Is that having ramifications in Eastern Europe or the Balkans?
Yes, I already mentioned that. Yes, it has ramification. And it's just for, as I mentioned in the beginning of this international context, and these reasons for the rising authoritarianism and populism all around the world is just this, I would say, declining US soft power, and in the last 4 years, this transactional foreign policy of the Trump's administration. So it's really, in that sense, it's because pro-democracy forces, not only in Serbia, but in the most parts of the world, are really looking towards a US, but it's really hard as an example. But it was really hard in the last few years to look at US as an example. So it was in that sense the position of the pro-democratic forces became even harder. So you had this EU, European Union geopolitical approach, and then you just had, on the other hand, you had this Trump's foreign policy. So it was really hard for all pro-democratic forces to advocate for democratic changes when all these things were happening in the countries which were supposed to be some kind of example for all of us.
I have a question in the chat room from Jeffrey Kolb. And the question is, what does China expect from Serbia in return for their investment?
Well, I already mentioned, but I can repeat or make it more clear. China has several interests. First of all, it's about their image and just strengthening their soft power there in the world, especially in Europe, by being present in Serbia. So it's also very, for China is very important, Serbia is a very important part of the puzzle for this Belt and Road initiative. Serbia is a transportation route. And what is Serbia already in the last 2 years took $5 billion of loans from China. So they have also these interests. And in many of the construction projects, they gave loans for their construction companies. They just are involved. And also in many of these projects, I think 50 or more % of the materials also come from China. So this is their clear interest to be present. And they have the foothold here, as I said, in a EU candidate country. So they are on the European soil. So, you know, they're in a country which is approaching the EU, but they do not have all these restrictions which EU member countries have. So, so it's an ideal situation for them, and also it always reminds me of my meeting with speaking of Serbian government and their logic. My meeting in 2013 with Hun Sen, with the Cambodian prime minister, we had said, okay, it's so easy to deal with China. You know, it's easy to get money from them, and from the West you have all these strings attached. And this is also the case in Serbia. You know, if you get some EU funds or from the West, they are strings attached. You know that they are public procurement rules, transparency, etc. And regimes usually do not like that. They want to use their money the way they want, not to be under some kind of monitoring system.
Jovan, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, with your education and background and all your experience, I'm sure there's a lot easier things that you could have done than be a pro-democracy activist. How difficult has this been for you, and how much of a personal cost has this been for you?
Well, there is a lot of costs involved in this political engagement, and but you know, since I first of all, since I came back from Indonesia, I was recalled early because of the change of government, and I was perceived as somebody who was appointed by the previous government, even though I was not politically active before, and I ended up as an ambassador there because of my Harvard experience. My classmate was was the son of then Indonesian President SBY, the Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. And thanks to him, after that, I spent summer in Indonesia working rather unusually at the office of the President of Indonesia with a long-term foreign policy advisor to the President and later Indonesian ambassador to US, Dinapati Jalal. And when I came back, I was offered to be ambassador because of my experience and connections I had in Indonesia. But despite all of that, I was perceived as somebody who is member of the previous regime, and I was recalled early. And then, even then, when I came back to Serbia, it was hard for me to find any proper job because I was perceived in my field, in diplomacy. I left the ministry, and I just decided that I should get involved if I'm going to stay in Serbia. And I was elected in 2016. It was a really rough ride, also with that political organization, etc. But it's a different story. But we boycotted, which I boycotted, my organization boycotted the election, and now I face since August a similar situation, which is really hard to find some kind of appropriate job and position in Serbia, almost impossible, because I'm perceived as a threat. Even here, when we speak with the international organizations, they also cooperate with the regime, and they do not want to have someone who is a harsh opponent of the regime. So it's really some kind of catch-22. So it's really, really hard now for me. I've been involved in all opposition activities, joint activities for the last 3 years, and I signed all the agreements signed by the opposition leaders, and I'm still there. And we'll see. We will have early elections in probably April next year. So which is just confirmation that the boycott was successful, because we have practically no opposition in the parliament. Out of 250 MPs, the President Vučić party has 194 MPs, and plus 30 some of Socialist Party of late President Milosevic. So they have almost, it's like North Korea, the composition of the parliament. And even before the new legislature was constituted, the president announced that we would have early elections. But now we expect another round of dialogue between the opposition and the government and the regime that will start under the auspices of the European Parliament. And we formulated in the opposition 2 or 3 different platforms on the election conditions. So, and it is expected in February, March, this dialogue to start. And we hope that by the summer, we would agree on this, and we will have, what is much more important, this monitoring mechanisms, including particularly European Union, but also OSCE in controlling what we agree. So one of the main topics would be media, because opposition is not present even on so-called public television, and since came to power, President Vučić didn't have any debate with any opposition leader for almost 9 years. So he has this long monologues almost every day on this all these TV stations which are under his control.
Can I ask a question?
Okay. Go ahead then. Yeah. Go ahead.
Is there a USAID office in Belgrade, to your knowledge? Is there a USAID office?
Yes, it is, of course.
All right. Well, you said one of the important things is to support independent media. I would go to USAID and ask them if you could get some funding for the independent media. And can you have independent media? And would the government try to shut it down some way? Do you have the freedom to set up an independent media in Serbia? And if you do, you're looking for funding to do it or support. I think with Samantha Powers taking over, I think USAID, I don't know how much money they have in Serbia, but I know other places they give money to the local USAID, and then you can apply to them for funding. Have you talked to them about that?
No, I didn't talk about. I heard about that there should be a new project about supporting independent media. It should start this year. I even heard that it should be a $7 million project, but this is not the first hand. So, anyways, I'm still waiting to learn more about that, and I hope that it's going to happen sooner rather than later, because we really need that. But what I already said, it's very disappointing that even the U.S. Embassy marginalized people who, like myself, who are natural allies to even this. I had some expectation at the beginning of the term of the new ambassador. It's not new anymore, for over a year is here, and but you know, I never received any invitation and to talk either with him or with somebody else from the government. I was never invited even to this 4th of July receptions, etc. Even I was also, of course, in the parliamentary group of friendship with the US, etc. So this is not only my case. So many people who are should be like natural allies and friends of the US, and many of us who studied in the States. I studied twice, not only at Harvard, also before that in the late 90s to the Ron Brown Fellowship Program. And I'm the one who is keeping together in Serbia these people. We meet regularly, of course, before COVID. We met regularly a few times a year. And we also have this regional gathering every year, and some 40 to 50 people out of 500-600. We meet every year, and we keep the flame. And and even with people like ourselves, U.S. Embassy here doesn't maintain any close contact with. So this is a disappointment.
Will you be able to go to the embassy? Like, this is what I recommend to you if you're able to do it. Physically bring you and your friends to the embassy if they're allowed to do it. I don't know what the situation is in Belgrade, but you can't do it from a distance. You have to go like knock on the door, literally. I don't know. I know Stan worked at an embassy. I don't know if you're allowed to do that. I think in America, you should be able to do that. You should be able to go there, knock on the door and talk to whoever's there and say, look, this is what we want to have a meeting. If you can't do it by phone or by Zoom or some other way, the physical, when you're facing somebody face to face, it's a lot harder to say no.
Okay, well, I'll just comment. So I'm sure Jovan knows how to reach out to the embassy people, but
I don't know if he does. I don't know what he's.
But knocking on the door, or in this case, it'd be on a gate.
I don't know what is it locked up? Is it locked up?
No, but no,
With the high fence.
but definitely your advice is good, and I'm sure Jovan knows this. But I would suggest that two things are going to happen. One, you're going to have a totally different ambassador who's going to be receptive to you, and second of all, the staff that is there, they're going to be immediately receptive to you, even before or as soon as the current ambassador leaves, and probably even before that, because they'll be taking the lead from Tony Blinken and from Joe Biden. They won't be taking the lead from whatever ambassador is on their way out. So you might have to wait a few weeks, but
Or Richard Grenell.
but definitely a phone call or an email or a letter should get you access. And if it doesn't, let me know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but that's good advice by Andy. Did you want to comment on that at
Thank
all?
you. No. Of course, we will also wait maybe for another few weeks or so for dust to settle in Washington, I said, because it takes time, of course, especially such big systems as the US is and diplomacy, etc. But I'm sure that there will be positive changes, and we will try to use it.
Yeah, so sometimes ambassadors leave immediately, and sometimes they try to burrow in for a while. So we'll see what this guy's attitude is. But anyway, so listen, we're I think we're past your dinner time, and certainly at your children's bedtime now. So this has been an excellent discussion, and I just really thank you very much. You really covered everything in a very meaningful and sincere way, and so we're really appreciative. I think that our audience here is very concerned about democracy in Serbia, and democracy in this country for that matter. So So thank you very much, Jovan.
Thank you. Thank you once again for this opportunity, and I'm always available. So please don't hesitate to contact me for whatever. So you already know that, Stan. So
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank
thank you.
you. A
Bye.
virtual call too. Thank you.